This is Duke University.
We're very delighted to have Professor Sylvia Alajaji from Franklin and Marshall visiting us, Professor of Music, the chair of the Music Department. And you do such fascinating work using the lens of music in Middle Eastern cultures to ask all these broader questions about identity and construction, memory, history. And I wanted to get you started with a conversation about your recent book that is coming out, and congratulations.
Thank you.
What's the title of it?
Music and the Armenian Diaspora, Searching for Home in Exile.
Okay. Yeah. And in your book, as I understand, you are using the lens of music to ask some broader questions about the way that Armenian identity is constructed. Could you take us through how the situation of diaspora and music helps us understand the Armenian experience better?
Yeah, one thing that I always say when I'm talking about my research, with the why music question, is when you're dealing with very, very sort of complicated issues and very hot topic issues, such as the Armenian genocide, or with my other research, the Palestinian occupation, sometimes people are resistant to talk about those directly. But then when you ask about music, you realize that they are talking about those things, but through such a different lens where they almost feel a little bit more comfortable talking about it. And it's also very, very personal, what they love and what they love to listen to and what it means to them. And so I really love having that opportunity to talk to people. But what I realized in my conversations over time is that there were certain things being said that spoke to something much larger than just music. So for the Armenians specifically, at certain times in my research, I would be admonished for talking about a certain artist, or I would, be told, well, you must talk about this because this is our true Armenian music. And me being Armenian myself, I often got a little bit more pressure to talk about certain things that would really represent Armenians to, the rest of the world. And so from there, I just really started thinking, how are these notions constructed of what we use to represent who we are to the world? And it was very interesting for the Armenians. Specifically, music was actually a very, very controversial topic. The more I started digging, the more I realized that, you have to be very careful with how you define what Armenian music is or what it is not.
And you've talked a little bit about how the construction of Armenian music in a place like Lebanon looks very different than Armenian music in, for example, the United States.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So, there tends to be, in a lot of discussions of the Armenians, or really any group, we tend to paint them with this very broad brush, the Iranian diaspora, the Armenian diaspora. And when you start to look at the different diasporic communities, you realize they are so different from one another, because the situation for the Armenians specifically, the situation in the US could not have been more different than the situation in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, the Armenians were granted a considerable amount of autonomy from the government, and that really allowed them to conceive of themselves and their identity in a much different way than, for example, the Armenians in the United States. And once again, because music is one of the primary ways where, especially for groups in exile, they don't have physical borders under their control. They don't have a lot of political control. So culture is very much under their control, and they can use that to present an image of themselves to the world that they have some control over. And in Lebanon, music really became one of those things, where they were like, this is who we are, and they really embraced that. And so a fascinating genre emerged there known as estradain, and it's a fun genre, but it also was quite revolutionary for the Armenians there.
And was there a way in which, in the Lebanese context, perhaps as distinct from the American context, music itself became either constructed as more pure or essentialist, and all of them with huge air quotes around them?
Yeah.
And were there ways in which the construction of this politics of authenticity tied back to people's notion of who they are?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for example, one of the big controversies that I talk about is, how much the Armenians in the diaspora were going to keep alive the music from the Ottoman Empire that the survivors had brought with them. And the thing that made it so complicated was, in this music that the survivors had brought with them from the Ottoman Empire, embedded in this music were signs of what is now taken to be as Turkishness. There was Turkish language was in there. There were instruments there, like the oud that is shared. And so for a lot of Armenians to claim this music as theirs is to admit that there's this sort of shared culture between the two. And right now, as there continues to be denial of the genocide, and as the genocide still factors, so strongly into the identity of the Armenians, it's a very difficult thing to,
acknowledge
to
shared.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
I mean, it's a very painful thing, and so. It's one thing that you can sort of look at like, oh, how beautiful to find this sort of fusion music and then all of this stuff. But the reality is that for both Turks and for Armenians, it's a very difficult thing to have to acknowledge that this exists.
So how would some Armenians attempt to downplay that shared musical heritage? Is there a sense of writing out?
That's a difficult question to answer. It is written out, but only in the public sphere, really. So, for example, like if you were going to have like a night of Armenian music, like if a community was going to sponsor something like this, to have this music, on a public stage would be something rather controversial. But in the private realm, so if you are Armenian and you go to an Armenian person's home, you could maybe play this music and it would be sort of acknowledged among you that we're in a private sphere, that, we're not, the gaze is not upon us here, So it's very much so when we're talking about, where is it allowed, where is it not allowed, you have to sort of talk about the public-private dimensions to this. So it becomes, rather complex.
And the complexity is always where the
I
fun
know,
is,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I love it. So.
And in some of your writings, you've talked about the multiple layers of some of your own identity, of having grandparents who speak Turkish, and then thinking of an Armenian and a Lebanese heritage. Can you talk a little bit about that for some of our audience who may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always acknowledge that up front because a lot of the questions that I ask come from my own background. I am Armenian. My grandparents were survivors. But they ended up in Lebanon after the genocide, and then my parents came to Oklahoma, and so I grew up in a very, very small Armenian community, and I always had this sense that I wasn't Armenian enough in a way, even though I'm fully Armenian. I didn't have the IAN on my last name. Physically, I don't immediately read as Armenian, and I just started wondering, what is it that is making me feel that I'm not. Where is the sense that there is, a correct way of being Armenian coming from? And again, this is not at all unique to the Armenians. I think all of us, who have these sorts of identities question, what is it to be the thing that we are, and where does that come from?
Where does it come from?
Yeah.
And I think the last specific question that I have is one of the areas that your research opens up is this question of diaspora and homeland.
Yeah.
So often we tend to think of diaspora as having a relation to one specific homeland. And I think part of what your research is pointing us to is that the notion of peoplehood and identity for Armenians doesn't necessarily bear a linear relationship to the land of Armenia today.
Exactly.
Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, exactly. And once again, just to bring in a personal dimension here, if I was to trace where my grandparents had come from, I would not go to the country of Armenia as it is today. I would go to present-day Turkey. And it's very interesting because, in April, this past April, during the 100th anniversary of the genocide, Armenia was sort of where the celebrities were going, the Kardashians, where the celebrities were going to commemorate the genocide. And I realized that we have sort of constructed this linearity between the country of Armenia and the diaspora, when the truth is that it's much more diffuse, and within the diasporic identity, so much of it has to do with where you ended up after leaving the Ottoman Empire. And so for families like mine, Lebanon factors just as much into my identity as the United States does, and so Lebanon's wounds became our wounds, and so that sort of became part of the very complex picture. So when we insist on this linearity, we're really leaving out so much of what actually makes us, who we are. So
amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation on the lens of music as a way of understanding Armenian identity and peoplehood. Thank you.